The planet Verath 9 was the kind of place where things went to be forgotten. No cities, no forests, no rivers, just endless white salt flats stretching in every direction, under a sky the color of a bruise, and two pale moons that hung low at night like the eyes of something watching from far away. Cale Maddox had lived here for 3 years, and in that time he had spoken to maybe 40 people total, most of them through a crackling radio that barely held a signal past the horizon. He was a human, and he was alone, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He had been a sergeant once in the Terran Marine Corps, back when that title meant something to him, back when he still believed that fighting alongside others made the losses easier to carry. But it did not. He lost his squad on a moon called Hestia 3, all 7 of them, in a collapsed tunnel during a routine clearing operation, and after that, Cale stopped believing in routine anything. Discharged papers, bought a broken-down crawler vehicle, flew to the most empty planet he could find on a trade map, and built himself an outpost from salvaged ship parts and silence. Now he made his living by stripping crashed vessels that littered the salt flats, old freighters, abandoned shuttles, the occasional smuggler wreck, and selling the parts to traders who passed through the sector every few months. It was not exciting, it was not noble, and most days it was barely profitable. But it was quiet, and quiet was the only currency Cale valued anymore. On the morning everything changed, he was 40 kilometers east of his outpost, running his ground scanner over a half-buried cargo pod, when the scanner chirped in a way it had never chirped before. He looked down at the screen and frowned. There was a signal, faint, repeating, and coded in a format he recognized immediately. It was a Galactic Union biodistress beacon, the kind of emergency implant that most species had surgically embedded near their hearts, designed to activate automatically when the body entered critical danger. Someone was dying out here. Cale stood up straight and turned slowly, scanning the horizon, as if he could see the source with his bare eyes. But there was nothing, just white ground and purple sky, and the low hum of wind pushing dust across the flats. He looked at the scanner again, and noticed 2 things that made his stomach tighten. First, the signal was moving, but slowly, maybe 2 or 3 kilometers per hour, which meant whatever was carrying the signal was not a vehicle. Second, the signal was weak, far weaker than it should have been, which meant the person had been broadcasting for a long time, and their body was running out of energy to power the implant. Cale stood there for about 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds he had a very simple conversation with himself. His problem, not his sector, not his species most likely, and go back to pulling copper wire out of a dead cargo pod. Or he could follow it. He climbed into his crawler and turned east. The trail found him before he found the signal. About 15 kilometers out, his crawler rolled over a ridge, and he saw it. A long, ugly gouge in the salt crust, stretching from the south and curving northeast toward the dark line of the Thornback Canyons on the horizon. He stopped the vehicle and got out to look. The gouge was about half a meter wide and deep enough to expose the dark rock beneath the salt. And on either side of it there were enormous claw marks, 5-toed, each print the size of Cale's torso, pressed deep into the ground with the kind of force that only something very large and very heavy could produce. And there was blood. Not red, violet, pale and almost luminous in the fading light, smeared along the edges of the trail in long streaks. That told a story Cale did not want to read, but could not stop himself from understanding. Something had grabbed a living being and was dragging it across the surface of this planet. He knelt and touched the violet blood with his fingertip, then rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. It was tacky but not dry, which meant this part of the trail was maybe 3 or 4 days old. He stood up and looked along the length of the gouge, following it with his eyes, toward the northeast, where it disappeared into the haze. Then he looked the other direction, back toward the south, and saw that the trail went on and on and on, far beyond what he could see, which meant this had been happening for much longer than 3 days. He got back in the crawler and followed the trail. As the hours passed and the twin moons rose, Cale checked the scanner every few minutes and watched the signal grow slightly stronger, which meant he was gaining ground. Pulled up everything he knew about the local megafauna on his outpost database, and when the profile loaded, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Gravejaw. That was what had made this trail. A gravejaw was a 6-legged predator roughly the size of a Terran freight truck, armored in overlapping bone plates, with a primary jaw strong enough to crush spacecraft landing struts, and a secondary set of smaller jaws behind the first that it used to grip prey without killing it. Because gravejaws did not kill their food right away, they dragged it, alive, conscious, suffering, back to their nesting caves in the Thornback Canyons, where their young would feed on the still-living prey over the course of weeks. It was one of the cruelest survival strategies in the known galaxy, and every species that had studied it agreed on one thing: do not interfere. It is simply nature. Cale closed the database file and drove faster. Near midnight, he reached the edge of the canyon region, where the flat ground began to crack and rise into jagged formations of dark rock that looked like broken teeth against the moonlit sky. He stopped the crawler on a ridge and pulled out his long-range scope. He swept the scope across the canyon mouth, slowly, carefully, until the movement caught his eye. Something massive, low to the ground, pulling itself forward with that terrible 6-legged gait that gravejaws used when they were carrying weight. And behind it, caught in the grip of those secondary jaws, dragged across the broken ground like a forgotten thing, was a figure, small, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in ways that spoke of broken bones, and skin that should have been glowing. Cale knew enough about xenobiology to recognize a Valith when he saw one, but the glow was almost gone, just a faint flicker like a candle flame in a storm, pulsing weakly in the dark. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Lowered the scope, and sat very still for a long moment. The smart thing to do was call it in, report the beacon, let the Union handle it on their schedule, and go home. He started the crawler's engine. Then he reached behind his seat and pulled out the old duffel bag he had not opened in 3 years, the one with the Terran Marine insignia stitched on the side, the one that held his combat gear, his weapons, and every tool of violence he had sworn he was done with. He unzipped it. The smell of gun oil hit him like a memory, and for just a second he was back on Hestia 3. Back in the dark, back with his squad. Then he was here again, on a dead planet, watching a child be dragged into the dark by something that had no right to her. He loaded his weapon and drove into the canyons. Ryla Sen had stopped counting the hours on the 4th day, because counting meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding what was happening to her. And understanding was a door she could not afford to open. So she closed her eyes and let herself drift. She was 19 years old by the Valith calendar, barely an adult, the only daughter of Ambassador Talon Sen, who served the Valith consulate in the outer trade corridors. She had been traveling aboard a diplomatic shuttle, a small, lightly armed vessel, when the raiders hit. They came out of nowhere, 3 fast attack ships with no identification markings, and they tore through the shuttle's shields in less than a minute. Ryla remembered the alarms, the screaming, the crew shouting for everyone to get to the escape pods. She remembered being pushed into a pod by hands she never saw the faces behind. She remembered the pod launching and the violent shaking as it entered the atmosphere of the nearest planet. She remembered the crash. The pod hit the salt flats of Vareth 9 at an angle that crumpled the front section and threw her against the wall hard enough to snap her left arm at the elbow and crack 3 of her ribs. Valith bones were hollow, light, beautiful in their structure, evolved for a low-gravity homeworld where the air was thick and warm, and nothing ever needed to be strong. On this planet, under this gravity, her bones were like glass. She crawled out of the wreckage and lay on the white ground under a purple sky and tried to breathe through the pain. Her emergency implant activated on its own. She felt the tiny pulse near her heart as it began broadcasting the distress signal, and she thought, "Someone will come. Someone will hear this. I just need to wait." She waited. No one came. On the first night, the Gravjaw found her. She heard it before she saw it. A deep vibration in the ground, like a drum, beating far below the surface, and then it was there, rising out of the dark like a mountain that had learned to walk, 6 legs moving in a horrible rhythm, bone plates shifting and clicking as it lowered its massive head toward her. She screamed, but no sound came out because her lungs could not fill properly, with the broken ribs pressing inward. The beast studied her with 4 flat black eyes that reflected the moonlight like wet stone. Then its secondary jaws opened, a smaller set of mandibles behind the primary mouth, lined with backward curving teeth designed not to tear, but to hold. And they closed around her left leg, just below the knee. The pain was so far beyond anything she had ever experienced that her mind simply refused to process it, and she blacked out. When she woke, she was being dragged. The ground scraped against her back and shoulders and the back of her head as the beast pulled her forward at a steady walking pace, never slowing, heading northeast toward the dark shapes on the horizon that she would later learn were the Thornback Canyons. Her leg was numb below the jaw's grip, which she supposed was a small mercy. Everything else hurt. She tried to pull free, but her body had no strength left, and the beast did not even seem to notice her struggles, the way a person might not notice a leaf caught on their shoe. On the second day, a trading vessel passed overhead. She saw its engine trail across the sky, and she tried to wave, tried to call out, tried to make herself visible on this endless white plain, but the ship passed without slowing, and the sky was empty again. On the third day, she stopped trying to signal for help and began talking to herself instead, whispering in Valith because the sound of her own language was the only comfort she had left. She recited old poems her mother had taught her, diplomatic greetings in 12 languages, the names of every river on her home world. On the 5th day, she realized her bioluminescence was fading. For a Valith, their glow was everything. It was mood, it was health, it was identity, it was the visible expression of being alive, and when it began to dim, it meant the body was giving up. She watched the soft blue-white light under her skin flicker and weaken like a power cell draining to nothing, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was going to die in the jaws of an animal, on a planet she had never heard of, and no one was going to stop it. On the 7th day, in a fever state between sleep and waking, she remembered her mother's voice telling her about humans. Her mother had met them during a trade summit years ago and had come home with a strange expression. Not fear exactly, but something close to wonder mixed with confusion. She had said, "They are the galaxy's contradiction. Soft bodies, short lives, no claws, no venom, no armor, no telepathy. Nothing that any sensible evolution would consider an advantage. And yet every species that has ever cornered them has learned to regret it." Ryla had asked why. Her mother had paused for a long time and then said, "Because they do not know when to stop, and because they care about things that give them no survival benefit, and the combination of those two qualities is the most dangerous force in the known universe." Ryla had laughed at the time. She was not laughing now. She was being dragged across a dead world by a creature that saw her as nothing more than fresh food for its young, and the signal in her chest had been screaming into the void for over a week, and the void had not answered. Meanwhile, 40 kilometers behind her in closing, Cale Maddox was driving his crawler through the night, with his jaw set and his hands tight on the controls. He had tried the official channels. He had radioed the nearest Union Ranger station and reported the distress signal and the Gravejaw Trail, and the ranger on duty, a Tessic, one of those large insectoid species that prided themselves on ecological balance, had listened politely and then informed Kale that Gravejaws were a protected species under the Vareth 9 Wildlife Preservation Accord, and that any interference with their natural hunting behavior carried a fine of 12,000 galactic credits and possible imprisonment. Kale had asked, and the person being dragged to death? The ranger had said, a recovery team can be dispatched, pending approval from the Regional Wildlife Board. Estimated response time 4 to 6 standard weeks. Kale had stared at the radio for a long moment. Then he said, "Copy that. I will pay the fine." He switched the channel to the Valith diplomatic frequency. He had guessed the species from the blood color, and reached a consular aide who expressed deep concern and promised that an emergency medical frigate was being redirected to the sector and would arrive as soon as logistically feasible. Kale asked when. The aide said, approximately 11 standard days. The girl had already been out there for 8. Kale turned off the radio and drove faster. In the back of the crawler, he had already laid out his gear, the old Marine kit, battered and patched but functional. And as he drove, he mentally inventoried what he had. 1 ballistic shotgun with 42 shells, 8 of which were incendiary. 1 sidearm with 3 magazines. 1 combat knife with a 20-centimeter blade. 1 welding torch with a half-full fuel cell. 1 portable medical kit with biofoam, clotting gel, synthetic skin patches, and painkillers. And 1 sheet of hull plating from a crashed freighter that he had spent 2 hours cutting and welding into a crude shield because he had read the Gravejaw's profile, and he knew that when it charged, it would lead with its primary jaws and aim for center mass. He was not a young man anymore, and he was not fast, and he was not strong the way he had been at 25. But he was a human, and humans had a quality that no xenobiologist had ever been able to properly classify. A quality that showed up in their behavior again and again across every planet they had ever set foot on. They did not stop. Not when it was smart to stop. Not when every calculation said to stop. Not when their bodies were broken and their odds were 0 and every other species in the galaxy would have filed a report and moved on. They simply did not stop. Kale drove through the night and into the dawn, and when the sun rose over the Thornback Canyons, he could see the fresh trail leading into the jagged rocks ahead. He checked his weapon one last time, strapped the shield to his left arm, and stepped out of the crawler into the hot wind. Somewhere ahead, in the dark of those canyons, girl was still alive. He intended to keep her that way. The Thornback Canyons were not meant for walking. The rock was dark, almost black, and it grew out of the ground in jagged spires and broken walls that leaned at angles that made no geological sense, as if the planet itself had tried to build something here and given up halfway through. The paths between the formations were narrow, uneven, and littered with loose stone that shifted and cracked underfoot with every step. Kale moved through them slowly, his shield on his left arm and his shotgun in his right hand, following the violet blood trail that painted the ground in long smears between the rocks. The twin moons had set, and the canyon was dark, truly dark, the kind of dark that pressed against the eyes and made the brain invent shapes into nothing. And Kale navigated by the dim green glow of his helmet's visor display, which turned the world into a flat map of edges and shadows. The blood trail was fresher here, which meant he was close. Could smell it now. Not just the blood, but the Gravejaw itself. A thick animal stink like old meat and hot metal that clung to the rocks and filled the narrow passages with a heaviness that made breathing feel like work. He checked his scanner. The distress signal was less than a kilometer ahead, stationary now, which meant the beast had reached its destination. The nesting cave. Kale moved faster, but he did not run, because running made noise, and noise in these canyons carried in ways that could alert everything within a 2-kilometer radius. And the last thing he needed was attention from anything other than the one creature he had come to fight. He got attention anyway. The juvenile Gravejaw came out of a side passage with no warning. One moment the path was empty, and the next there was a shape exploding out of the dark, smaller than the adult, but still the size of a large horse, all legs and jaw and momentum. It hit Kale before he could raise his weapon. The impact drove him backward into the canyon wall, and the rock bit into his back through his armor, as the juvenile's primary jaw snapped shut centimeters from his face, close enough that he could see every ridge on its bone plates, and feel the heat of its breath on his skin. He shoved the shield forward into its throat, and pushed, buying himself a half-second of space, and then brought the shotgun up under its chin and fired twice. The first shot cracked its jaw plate. The second went through. The juvenile made a sound like tearing metal and collapsed sideways, its legs thrashing against the canyon walls and sending showers of rock chips into the air. Kale stood over it, breathing hard, and waited until it stopped moving. Then he looked down at himself. The juvenile's claws had caught him across the torso, 3 long gashes running diagonally from his right shoulder to his left hip, cutting through the outer layer of his armor and into the skin beneath. Blood, red human, was already soaking through his suit. He set down his weapon and pulled out the biofoam canister from his kit, sprayed the gashes with a thick layer of the white expanding sealant, and clenched his teeth as the foam hardened and the chemical burn of the bonding agent hit his nerve endings. His suit's medical readout blinked amber on his visor display. Moderate blood loss, elevated heart rate, early signs of shock. He dismissed the alert and picked up his weapon and kept walking. The nesting cave opened up ahead of him like a mouth in the rock, a wide, low entrance beneath an overhang of dark stone, with the violet blood trail leading straight inside. Kale paused at the entrance and listened. He could hear them, the juveniles, at least 3 of them, making low clicking sounds that echoed off the cave walls, and beneath that, the deep, slow breathing of something very large. Display because the green glow would give him away in the dark of the cave, and he stepped inside blind. The smell hit him first. Old blood, old death, the accumulated rot of dozens of kills dragged here over months or years, and he had to stop and breathe through his mouth to keep his stomach from turning. He moved by touch, one hand on the cave wall, feeling the rock guide him deeper. The cave curved to the left, and then opened into a larger chamber. And here there was the faintest light, not from any external source, but from the far wall, where a shape lay crumpled on the ground, giving off a glow so weak it was barely more than a suggestion of color. Ryla. She was on her back near the cave wall, surrounded by old bones and dried remains of previous kills, and 3 juvenile Gravejaws were circling her slowly, nudging her with their snouts, testing whether she was alive or dead. Her glow pulsed once, faintly, and the nearest juvenile snapped its jaws experimentally near her arm. She did not move, but she was breathing. Kale could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, and he could see her face, bruised and cut and hollow, with 10 days of suffering, and one eye was open, staring at nothing, the light behind it almost gone. He stepped into the chamber. The juveniles noticed him first. Their heads snapped up, and their clicking sounds intensified, and they scattered backward toward the far wall, uncertain of this new shape that smelled of blood and fire. Then the adult Gravejaw moved. It had been lying along the side wall, so large and so still that Kale had mistaken it for part of the rock itself, and when it rose to its full height, the cave seemed to shrink around it. 6 legs unfolded beneath a body covered in bone plates, the color of old iron, and its head swung toward Kale with those 4 flat black eyes catching the faint glow from Ryla's skin and reflecting it back like dark mirrors. It was the size of a freight vehicle, and it filled the cave the way a nightmare fills a room, completely and without mercy. Kale raised his shotgun and fired an incendiary round into the ceiling above the beast's head. The round detonated against the rock and sent a shower of burning fragments down onto the Gravjaw's back, and the beast roared, a sound so deep and so loud that Kale felt it in his ribs more than he heard it in his ears, and charged. Kale threw himself to the left as the beast's primary jaws slammed shut where he had been standing, and the impact cracked the cave floor and sent tremors through the stone. He rolled, came up on one knee, and fired 3 more rounds into its left flank. The shells hit the bone plates, and 2 of them bounced off, but the third found a gap between the plates near the shoulder joint, and the beast screamed and swung its massive head sideways. The head caught Kale across the chest and launched him into the cave wall. He hit the rock, and something in his left arm made a sound that arms should not make, and the pain was instant and enormous and white. He landed on the ground, and the Gravjaw was already turning toward him, jaws opening, and Kale looked up and saw the rock shelf above the beast, a jutting slab of stone, held in place by nothing more than the ancient pressure of the canyon walls. He aimed at the base of the shelf and fired his last 3 incendiary rounds in rapid succession. The rock cracked and groaned and then gave way. The shelf came down on the Gravjaw's hind legs with a sound like a building collapsing, and the beast went down, its rear half pinned beneath a ton of broken stone, its front legs clawing at the cave floor as it tried to pull itself free. Kale got to his feet. His left arm was useless, broken somewhere between the elbow and the wrist, hanging at his side, and his vision was blurred from the impact with the wall. The biofoam on his torso was cracking from the movement, and blood was seeping through again. He walked toward the beast. It lunged at him with its primary jaws, and he sidestepped and shoved the barrel of the shotgun into the gap where the jaw met the skull, and pulled the trigger. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. The beast shuddered with each shot, and on the 4th, it went still. Kale stood there in the sudden silence, covered in blood, his own and the creature's, holding an empty weapon, swaying on his feet. Then he dropped the shotgun and pulled out the welding torch. He looked at his left arm, which was swelling and turning dark, and he knew the broken bone had nicked something that was bleeding inside, and if he did not seal it, he would pass out within minutes. He pressed the lit torch against the wound on his forearm, where the skin had split open, and held it there for 3 seconds. He did not scream, but the sound he made was somber. Close. Then he turned away from the dead beast and limped toward the back of the cave where Ryla lay. He knelt beside her. She was barely conscious, her one open eye drifting until it found his face, this strange, blood-covered, broken creature that had walked into a monster's den and torn it apart with tools and fury and nothing else. Kale reached out with his good hand and touched her shoulder, gently, the way a person touches something they are afraid might break. He said, "Hey, you are all right now. I have got you." Her bioluminescence flickered once, a single pulse of pale blue light that moved across her skin like a heartbeat, and then her eye closed. But she was breathing, and that was enough. Kale could not carry her. His left arm was broken and sealed with a crude weld that throbbed with every heartbeat. His torso was held together with biofoam that was already starting to crack, and his legs were shaking with the kind of deep fatigue that came not from exercise, but from blood loss and shock. So he built a sled. He worked in the cave by the dying glow of Ryla's skin, using his combat knife and his one good hand to cut strips of hide from the dead Gravjaw's underbelly, where the skin was softer than the bone plates. He lashed the strips together with wire from his kit and stretched them over a frame made from the beast's own rib bones, long, curved, and strong enough to hold a body. The irony was not lost on him. pulling the girl out of the monster's cave on a sled made from the monster itself. He doubted it would be lost on her either, if she ever woke up enough to notice. He lifted her onto the sled as carefully as he could manage, with one arm, and she made a sound when he moved her, a thin, broken whisper that was not quite a word in any language he knew, but carried the meaning of pain clearly enough that he flinched. He strapped her down so she would not slide off, checked her vitals with his suit's scanner. Alive, critical but stable, her body running on something deeper than physical reserves. And then he gripped the front edge of the sled and began to pull. The journey through the Thornback Canyons should have taken 6 hours at normal walking speed. It took Cale 14. Every step sent a jolt of pain through his broken arm and his torn torso, and the sled scraped and caught on the uneven rock, and twice he had to lift the front end over obstacles that he could barely see in the dark. And each time he lifted it, something in his ribs shifted in a way that made his vision go white at the edges. He kept walking. Not because he was brave. Bravery implied a choice, and Cale had stopped feeling like he had choices somewhere around the 3rd hour, when the pain settled into a constant background roar that filled his skull like static. But because the alternative was sitting down, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he sat down, he would not get up again. So he walked, and because the silence was worse than the pain, he talked. He talked to Ryla, even though he did not know if she could hear him, because talking kept his mind working, and his mind was the only thing keeping his legs moving. He told her about Earth. He told her about rain, how water fell from the sky in drops, sometimes gentle and sometimes hard, and how it sounded on a metal roof like 1,000 tiny drums playing all at once, and how after rain the air smelled clean in a way that no recycled ship atmosphere could ever match. He told her about oceans, how the water stretched all the way to the horizon and kept going, in and went out, in a rhythm that had been going on since before humans existed, and how standing on the shore of an ocean made a person feel both very small and very safe at the same time. He told her about dogs, how humans had taken wolves, actual predators, and through thousands of years of patience and companionship, had turned them into creatures that loved humans more than they loved themselves, and how that sent something important about the human species that Cale could never quite put into words. He told her about thunderstorms and autumn leaves, and the sound of snow falling in a forest at night, which was the quietest sound in the universe. He talked until his voice went raw, and then he kept talking in a whisper. Somewhere in the 7th hour, Ryla spoke. Her voice was so faint that he almost missed it, a thread of sound barely louder than his own breathing, and what she said was, "Why?" He stopped walking. Were still closed, but her lips had moved, and her glow had pulsed just once, which meant she was conscious enough to form a question. He said, "Why what?" She said, "Why did you come?" He stood there in the dark canyon with the sled rope cutting into his good hand, and his broken arm hanging at his side, and he thought about the question. No one comes to this planet to save people. That was what her question really meant, and she was right. No one did. He said, "Because I heard you." She was quiet for a long time after that, and he thought she had drifted away again. But then she said, "The signal. It had been sending for 8 days before you found it." Cale absorbed this. 8 days. The implant had been screaming for 8 days across every emergency frequency in the sector. And in all that time, on a planet that sat on a major trade route, with ships passing overhead daily, not one vessel had stopped, not one station had responded, had done anything, until Cale's ground scanner picked it up on day 8. By accident, while he was pulling copper wire out of a dead cargo pod. She asked him, her voice barely a whisper, "What did the others say when you told them?" He did not answer right away. Then he said, "They said help was coming, eventually. Ryla went silent, and in the faint glow of her skin, Kale could see something change in her expression. Not anger. The Valith did not do anger the way humans did, but something deeper and sadder and more permanent. Understanding. She understood now what her mother had tried to tell her about humans. Not that they were strong, or fierce, or dangerous, though they were all of those things, but that they existed in a galaxy full of species who had decided that certain kinds of suffering were acceptable, natural, not worth the inconvenience of preventing. And humans looked at that same suffering, and could not walk away from it. Because they were better. But because something in them was wired differently, some ancient circuit in the human brain that fired every time they heard a cry for help, and said, "That is your problem now, and it will remain your problem until it is solved or you are dead. And those are your only two options." Kale started walking again. By the 10th hour, he had cleared the canyons, and the salt flats opened up before him, white and flat and endless under the twin moons. And in the distance, he could see the dark shape of his crawler still parked where he had left it. He had never been so glad to see an ugly machine in his life. He pulled the sled the last 2 kilometers, in something between a walk and a stagger, loaded Ryla into the back of the crawler with the last of his strength, connected her to his suit's medical scanner, and started driving. He drove through the night. He drove with one hand on the controls because his other arm had stopped responding entirely, and the welding burn had started to blister, and his vision kept narrowing to a tunnel. And the only thing keeping him on course was the compass heading on his visor display, pointing toward home. He made it to the outpost just before dawn. He carried Ryla inside. How he managed this with one working arm, he would never be able to explain afterward, and laid her on his cot, and hooked up every piece of medical equipment he had. Her vitals were critical, but she was fighting. Whatever the Valith were made of, it was tougher than their hollow bones suggested. He activated the priority medical beacon on his outpost transmitter, the one reserved for life-threatening emergencies, the one that cut through all the bureaucratic channels and hit every ship and station within range, with a signal that basically said, "Someone is dying here. Come now." Then he sat down on the floor next to the cot, because his legs had finally decided they were done. The Valith medical frigate arrived 4 hours later. They came through the outpost door in a rush of sterile white suits and glowing instruments and urgent voices speaking in a language Kale did not understand. And they descended on Ryla with the kind of focused precision that only came from a species that valued every individual life as irreplaceable. The lead medic, a tall Valith with deep violet bioluminescence that marked him as a senior healer, examined Ryla and then turned to Kale with an expression that was equal parts awe and disbelief. He asked, "You extracted her from a Gravjaw nest, alone?" Kale, who was sitting on the floor in a puddle of his own blood, with biofoam cracking off his chest and his arm swollen to twice its normal size, said, "Yes." The medic looked at him for a long moment, and then said something in Valith to his team that Kale could not translate, but suspected was something along the lines of, "Get the human a doctor, before he dies, on this floor." They treated Ryla first. That was right. She needed it more. And then they turned their attention to Kale, and the quiet sounds they made as they catalogued his injuries told him he was in worse shape than he had allowed himself to believe. But he was alive. And on the cot, across the room, Ryla was alive. And just before the Valith sedated her for transport, she turned her head and found Kale with her eyes, and she reached out one trembling hand across the gap between them. He took it. Her glow pulsed, faint but steady, warm, a single sustained note of pale blue light that moved from her hand into his, and he did not need to speak Valith to understand what it meant. It meant, "I was alone in the dark for 10 days, and you came for me, and I will never forget." He held her hand until the sedative took her, and her glow softened into sleep. Then he let go and closed his own eyes. He had not slept in 3 days. He was asleep in seconds. 3 months later, Kale Maddox stood in a corridor on the Valith Embassy Station, orbiting the trade hub of Karis Point, wearing civilian clothes that did not fit properly and a regeneration sleeve on his left arm that itched constantly. And he wondered for the 15th time why he had agreed to come here. He did not like stations. Too many people, too much noise, too many walls between him and open sky. And he did not like formal occasions. And whatever this was, it was formal. The Valith aide who had met him at the docking port had been polite in the way that diplomats were polite, which meant every word was chosen with surgical precision, and every smile carried the weight of 1,000 years of cultural protocol behind it. The aide had led him through corridors that glowed with the soft bioluminescence the Valith built into everything, their walls, their floors, their clothing, and Kale felt like he was walking through the inside of a living thing, warm and pulsing and impossibly elegant. He felt like a stone in a river of light. They brought him to a private room, not a grand hall, not a ceremony chamber, but a small, quiet space with curved walls and soft seats, and a window that looked out over the stars. Ambassador Talon Sen was waiting for him. She was taller than her daughter, and older in a way that showed not in wrinkles or gray hair. The Valith did not age that way, but in the depth and steadiness of her bioluminescence, which glowed with a rich blue-white light that filled the room like moonlight on still water. She looked at Kale the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a long time. She said, "Sergeant Maddox, thank you for coming." He said, "It's just Kale. I have not been a sergeant in a long time." She nodded and gestured for him to sit, and he sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ambassador Sen said, "I want you to understand something before we begin. My daughter is alive because of you, and there is no diplomatic language in any of the 412 languages I speak that is adequate to express what that means to me. So I will not try to be diplomatic. I will simply say it plainly." She paused. She said 17 species received my daughter's distress signal. Kale looked at her. She said, 17. We confirmed this through Union Signal Archives after her recovery. Her implant broadcast on every standard emergency frequency for 10 days, and 17 different species, stations, ships, outposts, and patrol vessels registered the signal. 2 responded with scheduled aid. The Valith medical frigate that arrived after you had already rescued her, and a Tessic environmental survey team that filed a report and forwarded it to the Wildlife Preservation Board. 1 species, the Harith Collective, logged the signal as a natural predation event and archived it under ecological data. The remaining 14 did nothing at all. She let that number sit in the air between them. Then she said, 1 human, not a soldier, not a rescue professional, not someone with any obligation or order or institutional mandate. 1 human heard the signal and walked into a canyon full of predators alone and brought my daughter out alive. She asked, "What do you want in return?" Kale was quiet for a moment. He had thought about this on the way here, what the Valith might offer, what he could ask for, and every time he thought about it, the answer was the same. He said, "Nothing." Ambassador Sen tilted her head slightly, a Valith gesture that meant she was studying him the way a scientist studies something unexpected under a lens. She said, "Nothing. No land grant, no credit account, no ship, no commission, no title." He said, "I do not want anything. I just did what anyone would do." Smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, but a real one, warm and sad and full of something that looked like it might be love for a species she had spent her entire career trying to understand. She said, "That is the most human thing you could have said, and it is, respectfully, completely untrue." She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the stars. She said, I have served as an ambassador for over 40 years. I have studied 300 species. I have sat across negotiating tables from warlords and saints and everything between. And I can tell you, with absolute certainty, that what you did is not what anyone would do. She turned back to him. She said, "What you did is what humans do, and only humans, and I do not fully understand why, and I suspect you do not either, but I have stopped needing to understand it. I have simply learned to be grateful for it." The door to the room opened. Ryla Sen walked in. Kale had not seen her since the outpost, since the Valith medics had taken her away on a stretcher, with her glow barely visible and her hands still warm from holding his. She was different now. She was standing, upright, steady, without assistance, and her bioluminescence was back. Not the faint flicker he remembered, but a full, clear light that moved across her skin in slow waves, like sunlight on shallow water. She was beautiful, in the way that all Valith were beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with symmetry or proportion, and everything to do with the fact that their entire bodies expressed what they were feeling, and what Ryla was feeling right now was visible for everyone in the room to see. She was glowing like a sunrise, but she had scars, thin pale lines across her shoulders and back, where the ground had scraped her raw during 10 days of being dragged, and a ring of white scar tissue around her left leg below the knee, where the Gravjaw's secondary jaw had held. Valith healed almost perfectly. Their cellular regeneration was among the best in the galaxy, and the medics could have removed every trace of damage if she had allowed it. She had not allowed it. She had chosen to keep them. She walked toward Kale and stopped in front of him, and they looked at each other. The scarred human and the scarred Valith, two people who had been broken on the same planet and put back together with stubbornness and wire and whatever it was that made living things refuse to die. Ryla held up her hands, and between them was a thin cord that glowed with its own light, a woven braid of bioluminescent fibers that pulsed in a slow rhythm, alive in a way that was not metaphorical, but literal. She said, "This is a life thread." Kale looked at it. She said, "It is made from Valith bioluminescent cells, my cells, grown and woven into a bond cord that will attune to your nervous system when you wear it. It will glow in time with my heartbeat for as long as I live." She said, "Among my people this is the highest honor we can give. It marks you as kin-shielded, one who has bled for a Valith life, and it means that you are family, not by blood, but by something older and deeper than blood, by the debt that can never be repaid, but will never be forgotten." She stepped forward and tied the life thread around his right wrist. It was warm, warmer than he expected, and the moment it touched his skin, he felt it begin to pulse. A gentle rhythm that was not his own heartbeat, but hers, steady and alive and present. Ryla looked up at him, and her glow brightened until the whole room was bathed in blue-white light. She said, "You came for me." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will remember." He could not say anything after that, because his throat had closed in a way that had nothing to do with injury, and everything to do with the fact that he had spent 3 years alone on a dead planet, convincing himself that he had nothing left to give to anyone. And this girl, this fragile, unbreakable, luminous girl, had just shown him that he was wrong. Ambassador Sen watched from the window, with her hands folded, and her glow steady, and her expression full of the kind of quiet wisdom that came from watching the galaxy long enough to know what mattered and what did not. She said nothing. Nothing needed to be said. 2 weeks later, Kale was back on Vareth 9, alone again, in his outpost, surrounded by salvage and silence, and the endless white flats under the purple sky. But not quite the same. On his right wrist, the life thread glowed softly in the dark of his quarters, a steady pulse of pale blue light, beating in a rhythm that was not his own, a heartbeat from halfway across the galaxy. Ryla was alive. He could feel it with every pulse. And on the Valith embassy station, in the diplomatic archives, that would, eventually be distributed to every species in the Galactic Union. A new entry had been added to the Galactic Behavioral Index, the official classification system used to categorize and assess every known sentient species. The previous entry for humans had read, Persistence Class Predators, Moderate Threat, Low Cooperation Priority. It had been amended. The new entry, authored by Ambassador Taeon Sen and co-signed by the Valith High Council, read as follows. Humans are what happens when empathy evolves claws. They are soft-bodied, short-lived, devoid of natural armor, or venom, or telepathy, or bioluminescence. By every metric of evolutionary advantage, they should not have survived their own planet, let alone spread across the stars. And yet, they did. Not because they are the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest. They are none of these things, but because they possess a quality that no other species has been able to replicate or fully comprehend. They will not abandon those who are suffering, even when the suffering is not their own, even when the cost is their life, even when every rational calculation says to walk away. This is not strategy. This is something else, something written so deeply into their biology that they cannot override it, even when they try. We are amending our classification. Do not ignore their distress calls. More importantly, do not expect them to ignore yours. Kale read the entry once, on a datapad the Valith ambassador had sent him, and then he set the pad down on his workbench and looked at the life thread on his wrist. It pulsed. He went back to work, but he left the door of the outpost open because the wind was warm, and somewhere out there, past the salt flats and the canyons and the stars, someone was alive because he had heard her. And that was enough. That was more than enough.